Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Anticipation builds for the high-stakes summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Anchorage. Questions swirl about motives, outcome, and the geopolitical symbolism of the chosen venue. With Trump playing peacemaker and Putin seeking validation and leverage over Ukraine, both leaders approach the talks with overlapping yet sharply diverging ambitions. Joining us today on TVP World to unpack what's at stake is Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin, expert on U.S. foreign policy and global diplomacy. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So we're looking at this meeting, and before it even took place, Trump has been saying things like there's a 25% chance of failure and also talking about subsequent meeting. Now, going into this, I think there's a lot of anticipation. Do you think that Trump is now trying to temper down these kind of expectations?
I certainly think that the White House, in other words, the Trump administration, is pulling back from this idea of peace in our time. Remember, this is the man who said before he entered office in January 2025 that he could end the war within 24 hours, which was a bit of a far-fetched ambition given the Kremlin's aims. It's probably best to evaluate where we are now to see where we are in context, both of what Trump says and then the wider possibilities. First of all, I think it's important to note that the Kremlin did not seek or indeed give Trump this face-to-face meeting because it wants to negotiate a resolution and end to its invasion. The Kremlin did this, I think, first and foremost because it had come under pressure with the threat of toughened sanctions from Trump, because he was upset that Russia is not ceasefiring, that it continues to attack Ukraine, especially the attacks on civilians. So the Kremlin finally gave Trump this last card. Here, you can have this summit. But at the same time, they've restated their maximum demands. On Wednesday, the foreign ministry said our demands have not changed since June 2024. And when Vladimir Putin set those out, those include Russia seizing, quote, annexing more than 20% of Ukraine and having it legally recognized. It includes the lifting of all sanctions on Moscow. It includes Ukraine being weak and demilitarized. It even, at that point, Putin was trying to say, look, the Zelensky government should be forced out of power. Now, I don't see the Kremlin shifting that position on Friday. I think they'll try to spin Trump in two ways. First, they'll try to get him to adopt their positions. But if they can't do that, they'll put the talks on this wider discussion of a U.S.-Russian strategic relationship. In other words, let's get along militarily, let's get along economically, i.e. lift sanctions, and let's just put Ukraine to the side. Now that raises the question of how Trump responds to that.
All right, like I mentioned, now Russian President Putin is already talking about these strategic relationship and perhaps talking about striking some sort of deal with Donald Trump as well. Do you think that there's a risk, of course, that Russia might just be trying to throw Trump a bone and perhaps put the Ukraine's interests in the wayside?
No, that's not a risk. That's what's happening. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Russia doesn't have Ukraine's interest at its hearts here. It wants to, first of all, push back the sanctions threat, and then secondly, get Trump to repeat as much of their demands as possible. I have to emphasize to viewers, a deal cannot be made today. A deal cannot be made today because Ukraine's not at the table. And I think that means, and a lot of attention hasn't been paid, not enough attention has been paid to Ukraine and Europe, what they've done this week. What Ukraine and Europe have done, anticipating the Kremlin will try to spin Trump, is to try to set lines with him. And this culminated in that phone call on Wednesday. And what are the lines they set with Trump? First, a ceasefire is the priority. Well, you can't talk about exchange of territory or giving away territory or whatever about territory or even security guarantees until you have a ceasefire. Secondly, you have to ensure that there is a security guarantee for Ukraine so that Russia does not attack again. Thirdly, you have to give Ukraine a path to its economic and military future, which is a path to Europe, the European Union, and at least an association with NATO. Fourth, you have to enable the development of defense production and investment in Ukraine. That cannot be ruled out. And finally, fifth and importantly, if Russia does not agree to end its invasion, then sanctions should be increased. And interestingly, from the reports on that call, Trump accepted most of that. The problem here is that Trump listens to the last person in the room. So while he talked much more toughly about Russia and saying that a ceasefire was important going into today, will Vladimir Putin be able to flatter him and spin him around to a position which is 180 degrees in the other direction, that this is all Ukraine's fault?
What about people surrounding him? Because we've also seen people like Marco Rubio sounding off of pretty much what you just mentioned earlier, that a security guarantee has to be on the table in order for this ceasefire to be even upheld. How much of the Trump administration do you think is in favor of having some kind of security guarantee for Ukraine? And do you think that Trump will be swayed by them instead of probably falling into Putin's interest?
I mean, I think this is a vital question you've raised. This is not just Trump, it's the Trump administration, which has been split. We know that for months, certain officials, notably Trump's envoy to Russia, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, has essentially just supported all of the Kremlin's demands, or most of them. We know that J.D. Vance, the vice president, was talking about abandoning European and Ukrainian security. But on the other side, you had the envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, who did not want the U.S. to completely be in the Kremlin's pocket. And I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio tends to lean towards that position, although he's much quieter about it. It'll be interesting to see, by the way, if Vance's position has shifted. He has actually been in discussions with European leaders, including last week in England. Now, the problem here is that while you could say that those administration officials can sort of contain Trump, prevent him from being manipulated, the problem is, and I'm sure that the Kremlin wanted this, is that the first meeting today is going to be a one-on-one meeting between Trump and Putin with only translators present. And we know in Trump's first term that Putin manipulated him, for example, at the Helsinki meeting in 2018, later at the G20 summit in Germany, by getting him alone in a room. Only after you have that one-on-one meeting do the delegations meet. Will Trump be manipulated by that one-on-one meeting, where he effectively comes in allied with Putin, and it doesn't matter what his advisors say in the larger meeting around lunchtime today?
All right, and speaking of being one-on-one with Vladimir Putin, we talk about the decision of having kind of Zelensky not attend these meetings, or kind of having bilateral discussion about Ukraine without its involvement? What are the risks here, and what led to this decision?
Well, I mean, the risk has been the same risk when the U.S. went into direct talks with the Russians back in February and excluded Ukraine and Europe, and that is that they tried to impose a deal. In other words, that they imposed Russia's ultimatum on Ukraine. Now, Ukraine and Europe pushed that back, in part because Putin overplayed his hand. He didn't give any type of token compromise, and he continued this all-out assault, including the aerial assault on civilians. Will Russia make the same mistake this time? But no, I mean, it simply was bad optics, and it's the wrong way to make this a bilateral meeting between Trump and Putin. But again, what Ukraine and Europe have been very effective in doing in the past few days is to get themselves back at the table indirectly by having this phone call with Trump, by really persuading Trump that the Ukraine-Europe position has to be represented at this meeting, and by getting Trump to say, at least publicly, that as soon as he finishes the meeting with Putin, he'll begin trying to get a three-way meeting, which does include Vladimir Zelensky.
And speaking of the Ukraine-Europe position, how do you think yesterday's meeting between Zelensky and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is going to kind of shift the perception of this thing? Do you think that Europe is doing enough to try to bring Ukraine into the discussion?
I mean, the Starmer meeting with Zelensky yesterday, I think, was very much a public reinforcement of what was happening in that phone call with Trump and what's been happening for weeks, which is that Europe isn't united, with the exception of Mr. Orban in Hungary, behind Ukraine's independence, its sovereignty, and its resistance of this invasion. So those are important images to get out there. The reality has been that I think the European Union and individual members have been too slow at times throughout this invasion. But I think you have to give credit to most of the European Union, most of the members who have stepped up the military assistance, who have stepped up the financial assistance, who have stepped up the sanctions on Russia, and have done it when the Trump administration threatened to abandon Kyiv earlier this year. I think this will be a transformative moment beyond maintaining Ukraine's independence in the most important war in Europe since 1945. This is going to be a transforming moment for the EU and for NATO going forward. Poland is part of that, and you've been reporting on that I think there are eyes open now. People realize that Vladimir Putin's Russia is a threat and that European security cannot rest on looking towards Washington. You have to do it yourself.
Right, and speaking of giving some credit to the European Union for having helped out Ukraine so much, do you think that the fact that Trump and Europe have been butting heads a little bit will kind of have a negative impact on this credibility? And how seriously do you think the U.S. administration will be taking the European request of having or bringing in Ukraine into the conversation?
Well, I mean, the situation is not nearly as bad as it was in the first months of the Trump administration. Remember, this was a man who was threatening to pull out of NATO, a man who was insulting individual members, a man whose vice president went to the Munich Security Conference and said, look, we see no reason for the U.S. to be involved with European security. Now, here we are 6 months later in August, and the United States has restored military assistance to Ukraine, albeit through selling arms to NATO members who then transfer them to Ukraine. The U.S. is now involved in discussions of Ukraine's defense. And indeed, this week, the Trump administration has been open to talking about security guarantees for Ukraine. I wouldn't have thought we'd gotten to that position. I had written the Trump administration off. Now, it is true that it hasn't gone as far as to making sure that Vladimir Zelensky is at the top table in Alaska today. But at least that possibility of further talks is down the line. And a deal is not going to be imposed on Ukraine. So I think the U.S. position regarding Europe is in a better place. Apart from Trump's tariff chaos, which we can talk about in a separate program, it's in a better place than it was a few months ago. But again, the danger is that Donald Trump, within a few hours, if he decides Vladimir Putin is his best buddy yet again, could undo a lot of this good work.
Right, so we'll have to see how things shape out. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being with us and your input and insight. Stark Lucas, Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you, and thanks to all your viewers.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, stay tuned to TVP World.